Welcome to the UO Today podcast, conversations that offer a glimpse into the heart of the humanities at the University of Oregon. Listen as our faculty, students, and guests introduce ideas and research that help us reflect on the past, navigate the present, and imagine possible futures. I'm Leah Middlebrook, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Nicholas Forster, Assistant Professor of Cinema Studies at the University of Oregon. Forster is interested in cinema, popular culture, and Black performance over the last century. His research explores the relationship between race, creative social networks, and media to better understand how artists collaborate. Nick Forster, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Tell us a little bit about your background and what drew you to your field of inquiry or to academia. What brought you here?
Yeah, so I think I tend to view myself as a film and media studies scholar of Black study, and that's partly predicated on my training. I moved around. I went to three different undergraduate schools, and took some time off before then graduating with a BS in film and television from the College of Communications at Boston University. I worked at a high school, an alternative high school for a year, and then moved and did my PhD in two programs, which is a bit rare, and it was sort of fundamentally formative for my own approaches. And those programs were, or departments were, film and media studies and African American studies at Yale University. And I think from that has shaped my approach to all the work that I do, which is why I sort of frame myself as a film and media studies scholar of Black studies, or sometimes a Black studies scholar of film and media studies, which means that when I sort of enter conversations about film history or aesthetics or race, I'm bringing those elements of close analysis, production history, archival work, and oral histories from film and media studies with the sort of archival imagination, the ethics of care, and the political vision, or what the historian Vince Harding described as the responsibility to catch a light-filled vision. Bring those sort of things from Black studies to the object of inquiry, if you will, or whatever it is that I'm looking to research. And sort of what undergirds all of that is my investment or interest in what Stuart Hall once described as culture, one of his many definitions, but as a sort of dialectic between conditions and consciousness. And I tend to think of in my work, which is interested in a lot of projects that might not have been produced. They may have been written but never produced as a film. I'm interested in the conditions of, like, obviously what's the world that the object emerges in, but does it get distributed? How was it shared? Was it shared with friends? Was it in fragments? Was it replicated over time? How does it circulate? What is the trajectory of the project? That's sort of the conditions, along with obviously all of the sort of material realities. How was it shot? How was it written? Where was it written, under what sort of political regime, et cetera. And then the consciousness is sort of more of for me in this case, a kind of what are the metaphysical investments, perhaps, or what is the intention, the idea, the conceptual thrust of a project, even as I said, if it doesn't manifest itself in a fully fledged out film or book or novel that's published or exhibited. Um, so those are sort of where my commitments are and my intellectual genealogy, which I bring to everything that I look at, but specifically my current project on Bill Gunn.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought this project up because I was really interested in this. So you're working on a book about Bill Gunn and about Black film and theater in the middle of the 20th century. Can you tell us who was Bill Gunn?
Yeah, Bill Gunn was one of the first five Black directors hired by a major Hollywood studio, following Gordon Parks and Melvin Van Peebles. And he was an actor, a writer, a director who worked on the stage and also wrote novels, beginning in the 1950s until his death in 1989. He was someone who was very deeply respected within the industries, but frequently kept coming across a challenge of sort of I hesitate to sort of say this because it suggests that by making it, it would have been better. But his films or his plays kept coming to the precipice of being produced or becoming widely seen, but then getting shut down. So his first film, Stop, which is when he's hired in 1969 for Warner Brothers, he makes the film. It gets rated X. and then it's never released by Warner Brothers, and it still remains shelved. His next film, which is perhaps what he's most known for, is a sort of cult horror film called Ganja and Hess. It was made in 1974 and comes out and sort of emerges in the middle of, towards the tail end of the blaxploitation cycle. And Ganja and Hess is this film that's sort of seemingly more influenced by, as some people would see it, European art directors rather than the kind of action, fast-paced genre modes of blaxploitation. Uh, but his career really is when he starts, he's close associates with people like James Baldwin, James Dean, Montgomery Clift, Stephen Sondheim, etc. And he continues that sort of building those networks with major figures from James Earl Jones to Bill Cosby, um, but is never able to necessarily find the sort of public celebration despite being respected. I should say too, on top of being sort of having a career dotted with firsts, which is always a complicated thing, he did for a period of time too have plays that were going to be produced by the two biggest theatrical organizations in the country. In the late 1950s, that was the Theater Guild, which had, produced many of the titans of the mid-century, specifically a lot of leftist works. And then later on, he had an extended relationship with Joseph Papp of the Public Theater and the New York Shakespeare Festival. In fact, Gunn's final play premiered just after he passed away, and it was directed by Joe Papp, and it was the last play that Papp directed as well. So these are all kind of like dots over a 40-year period that I am trying to sort of connect because when I entered this project, I would talk to film scholars and I would talk to theater scholars, and some folks had heard of Gunn, and if they had, it was primarily through this film Ganja and Hess. And I've been privileged and lucky enough to work really over the last 8 to 10 years to try and help facilitate a broader acknowledgement of Gunn, but then also to work on this project, which will be hopefully do that more and give a very complicated, nuanced understanding of a figure who fundamentally confounded understandings of race and understandings of art and medium specificity.
Hmm. Really interesting. So was Gunn actually from LA? Where did he grow up and how did he move through these centers that you're finding?
Yeah, well, he hated Los Angeles. He grew up in Philadelphia, in West Philadelphia. He was the only child of a fairly successful family, a black middle class family. He was one of the first, as he narrates it, one of the first black families in the neighborhood, which was otherwise filled with communists, as he describes it, and leftists. His mother was a socialite and had great aspirations herself, but the family was well known enough that if you look at the social notices, particularly in the black newspapers of Philadelphia or Baltimore, you'll see little printouts about, oh, the Guns are doing this, or they visited these people. But in Gunn wasn't very successful in high school. He dropped out, and then pretty quickly he moves to New York, where he spends the majority of his life. He lives in New York City proper for a little while, but then moves to Rockland County, where he spends the last 30 years of his life. I should note here, Rockland County, which is sort of on the Hudson, it becomes a place for a lot of artists who often defy norms. It's a thing that I and a colleague of mine we've written about and published a special issue called the sort of the New York scene of filmmakers. But folks who live in on the Hudson and in Rockland County include people like Toni Morrison, the novelist, Jonathan Demme, the filmmaker, William Gaddis was Bill Gunn's neighbor, or basically the novelist. There were all these different figures who lived in there who sought to sort of typically follow a kind of more independent path for what the artist was. It's not that their work wasn't political, because it was political, but that they weren't as necessarily politically oriented or at the forefront driven by a political mission the way, say, maybe some of the Black Arts Movement figures like Amiri Baraka or Larry Neal would have been. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention another figure who resided in that area was Kathleen Collins, who Gunn collaborated with and was good friends. Kathleen Collins had been an activist and then became a writer and a filmmaker, and Gunn is featured in her only feature-length film called Losing Ground as an actor. But Collins was an amazing talent who also passed away far too early.
You just touched on the Black Arts movement. I know that's another interest of yours. Can you tell us more? First, I guess, just sort of tell us a little bit about the Black Arts movement, and then I'm interested in this intersection where Gunn comes up close to it, but is also doing different things.
The Black Arts Movement, the Black Arts Movement was a movement by Black artists across the country, although it's frequently thought to be in major cities like Newark and New York and Chicago. But it was throughout the country where there was a very specific political imperative to challenge the dominant, accepted, hegemonic forms of what art was. So, say art for art's sake. There's a long history of this, specifically in Black letters, or particularly in Black letters, and exchanges between people like W.E.B. Du Bois and George Schuyler. And that runs through, say, even folks like Ralph Ellison. But the Black Arts Movement was driven particularly by theater and poetry that had and communal. I hesitate to use this word, but sort of communal uplift. So you would have schools and theater performances that were in the streets that were geared towards everyday folks who could participate in a sort of functional kind of art that would enliven the consciousness and then rewrite what was possible in society. So there is obviously, or unsurprisingly, quite a bit of very strong language and a sort of manifesto element to some of the Black Arts movement. Amiri Baraka, again, the sort of maybe most notable uh, figure, describes wanting to have poems that kill, or Larry Neal talks about the end of the white thing. Uh, and it has a particular oppositional stance to dominant culture. Typically, in the way that the narr or frequently, I should say, in the narratives of Black art, the Black arts movement is sort of the propagandistic or political proponent, the artistic arm of the Black Power movement on one end, and then on the other end, you might have some folks who are interested in more naturalism, like Lorraine Hansberry early on, or what is going on at the same time as the Black arts movement, which is blaxploitation, which is viewed as the kind of commercial the commercial oppositional cycle or movement because it's invested obviously in Hollywood and in capital in a way that the Black arts movement wasn't. Film is a capital intensive art form. It's also a collaborative art form. In blaxploitation, while there were Black directors who worked in blaxploitation like Ossie Davis, like Gordon Parks or Gordon Parks Jr., many of the producers and the figures were white, and it was a place that it was a site for a lot of tension and contestation between some Black artists, whether they were actors or writers, and some white moneyed men. I think frequently that narrative, which not everyone agrees to, but for a while was the dominant narrative, uh, sort of squeezes out some of the connections between these two movements of blaxploitation and Black arts movement. I often say one of the things that I found was interesting was that Amiri Baraka was in a screening room trying to get funding from the folks who produced the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So while the Black arts movement is typically understood to be a primarily sort of poetic and theatrical enterprise, given the way in which that community building can happen and the low cost, there are connections between the Black arts movement and blaxploitation. And Gunn is kind of a figure who resides at the tension of both of them. He was someone who was very uncomfortable with the moniker of Black writer. He didn't want that thrust upon him, and he had a sort of deep investment in an idea of an artist that was defined by freedom. He said, "The only thing I'm compelled to do is make images that are true to my imagination." He thought art was can't be touched and shouldn't be necessarily politicized. So on that end, he seems to be away from the Black arts movement, and yet he was in circles and friends with Amiri Baraka, Nina Simone, the jazz artist and classical artist, Larry Neal, and other folks. And he worked in film and was interested in film as a medium. So he kind of confounds one of the things that makes it difficult to write about him, but also one of the reasons to sort of investigate this period of time is that he confounds the typical narratives that we have. And he wasn't alone. There were plenty of other sort of Black existentialist writers that we can think of, like Charles Wright, Robert Bowles, or Henry Van Dyke, figures who broke this kind of bifurcated or polemical vision of what Black art is in the late 60s and early 70s.
You mentioned that unlike some of the people you've been referencing in the past few minutes, it's hard to find some of Bill Gunn's works because so many of them weren't produced or didn't make it out into the public somehow. So I'm just curious, how do you go about finding those works? How do you know which archives to look in, and what are some discoveries?
Yeah, I think that is one of the major challenges. Been to over a dozen archives. Part of the answer, or I should just begin with, his papers are at the Schomburg in New York, which is, for those who are familiar, is a sort of preeminent archival repository in Harlem for Black art and culture, particularly in the 20th century. His papers were there, and they were processed in about 2016, around the time that I was beginning this project. Uh, the other places to look, though, are in the archives of folks who might be more famous, quite frankly, because he was involved in so many different worlds. I've spent a lot of time like, okay, let me go look at, for example, let me look at James Baldwin's papers and see if anything comes up because Gunn and Baldwin were friends or friendly. Um, and so constantly looking at other places, the Actors Studio and Lee Strasberg's papers at the Library of Congress. Gunn was not a member of the Actors Studio, but he hung around the Actors Studio, which was sort of the famous breeding ground for the thing that we occasionally reductively now called the method form of acting from folks like James Dean, Montgomery Clift, or Marlon Brando, a sort of more naturalistic style of acting. The other part has been in the oral histories I've done, and I've spoken to, over the last many years, over 200 people. And I learned very early on, and it was one of the things that became important in my investments, was that you talk to one person who would mention someone else, and things just kind of spiraled out further and further and further and further. And so you'd end up talking to people that you would never have been able to consider before because they would be like, oh, I remember this one night where I didn't know Bill very well, but we all went out and we had a great time, and these were the people who were there, and I have a photograph of it, and so you should talk to these people. And I've been very privileged and lucky that people have been so generous with me, either in their recollections or in trying to steer me a certain way. And it has been incumbent on me. The ethics of the project really matter to me. That I try and when I can build actually sustainable relationships with folks, and at the very least, try and connect people who may have been friends 30 years ago but lost someone's number. Um, and I'm able to at least to do that kind of connection with them.
That's just great. Um, Tell us some about your teaching. I'd love to hear about, how these projects make their way into the classroom and
So that's a very difficult thing. Once I was asked how would I teach the research methods that I do for this book to someone, and I said I wouldn't because it's so absolutely specific to this project, which is tied again to this idea of somebody who was very well respected within an industry but didn't have a massive um, public footprint. And I should also say at the same time was prolific. I mean, there's over 30 manuscripts and they're filled. He was a very private person, but they're filled with a lot of autobiographical details. That said, when I enter the classroom, I try and develop a very sort of engaged and accountable community among the students and myself. There are things that I always say, like, this is not my class, this is our class. And we try and develop community agreements about how the class will run. And, and I learned from a professor that I knew, a wonderful person named Jafari Allen in grad school. He used to ask folks in class, and I did this. He asked a series of questions, but some of them were, who do you love and who are you accountable to? And I don't get this question in every class, but I try and bring this to the forefront because I think asking those questions helps us cement in the classroom what our priorities are, what assumptions we might bring into the classroom, and what our commitments are to ourselves, but also to our family. Blood and non. I think that can help develop that kind of fellowship and create this space where we build fellowship not in spite of difference, but alongside difference. One thing that I also find really critical, given my Black Studies training, is frequently, no matter the class, to try and break. ideas of what a canon might be. So I teach an African American studies, an African American cinema class, and I'm pretty upfront that like this is not a class that's dedicated to a survey or the greatest, whatever that might be, Black American films, but these are films which, as any good class I think should, are directed towards a particular set of learning objectives. And oftentimes these are films which reveal the fallacy or the challenge of trying to focus on things that were just either box office successes or fit some sort of platonic ideal aesthetic. So I try and break that idea that like you come here, you come to the class, and then you'll leave with a comprehensive understanding of say African American cinema. I also, even in my sort of introductory class, this class called Media Aesthetics, Cinema 260, that any film major has to take. And I try to have the screenings feature a filmmaker from at least almost every screening from a different decade or from maybe a different country, and braid into the work an understanding not just about the topic at hand or the unit, which might be mise en scène or cinematography or editing, but also maybe some of the questions of labor below the line and above the line about how this film might come about, and what goes into the production of it.
Those sound great. And you said you're not teaching in the spring.
I am not teaching in the spring now, which I will be sad. I will be sad about because being in the classroom is invigorating and is sort of, I know you're not supposed to say this, but was really the impetus for me originally pursuing a PhD.
Well, that's interesting. Yes, I was going to ask you about also not just about what turned you to a PhD, although you've just answered that for us, but also what attracted you specifically to the University of Oregon?
Yeah, I think there's a lot here that's specifically in the cinema studies department where I am that's special in this moment. We are a pretty young department. The department's not even a decade old, and it's fast growing. And we're continuing. I've entered in this moment of continuous growth. I'm one of two recent hires in critical studies, and we're also having some faculty join us on the production end. And so we're in a space where we can really be on the ground floor to build on all of the incredible work of the professors here and the scholars here who developed the program and put in blood, sweat, and tears to make this a department, which is no easy feat. Um, but now, with some stability and a really substantial base of majors, we're one of the biggest majors in the humanities here. We can not just necessarily run on the sort of like emergency, put a fire out model. We can envision what we want looking forward 10 years or so. And that is particularly exciting to me. I love service and I love building programs. So being able to join this department and contribute with my expertise and be one part of a larger movement was particularly exciting for me.
Well, we really look forward to seeing how cinema studies develops and what kinds of projects this young department brings to fruition. That's really an exciting view into what's going on over there.
It doesn't hurt that it's beautiful here either.
I know, I feel the same way. Have you engaged in any filmmaking yourself?
Not in a long time. I mean, when I was a student, I made films, and the only sort of filmmaking I've done recently is more sort of experimental stuff. So, uh, an example of that might be I helped sort of co-curate or assist on an exhibition in New York that was dedicated to Bill Gunn, and I made a sort of short film about his television work that was related to his acting, and I also contributed an essay to it. So that kind of experimental working with footage rather than shooting a lot of my own. And I think this might also answer some of the earlier question, which was part of what attracted me to Gunn, was his acting. I mean, I think it's always very difficult for any scholar to answer why it is that they study the thing that they study. I think there are intellectual questions that are exciting. There are personal connections which could facilitate that. And in some cases, I do think perhaps the most authentic answer might come from a psychoanalyst. I'm not sure. But one thing that was absolutely true, and there were a series of things that had happened, but was really true for me about Gunn was when I watched him it seemed as though he was sort of sensitive to the world in a very nuanced and particular way. There's a philosopher I like named Stanley Cavell, who has written about film, and he notes that Cary Grant has the ability on camera to portray what thinking looks like. It's a sort of very, he doesn't say uncanny, but developed, it's a very specific thing to Cary Grant. And I always thought when I saw Gunn that he had the ability to portray empathy or a kind of attunement to the world in little gestures and in the way he moved his eyes and the presence on screen. And that was certainly a thing that was attractive to me in trying to understand this figure. And I bring that up again to say when I made this film for the exhibition, it was tied to those sort of acting skills in television.
Thank you so much for giving this view into Bill Gunn. And I think everyone listening to this absolutely cannot wait to read your book when it's ready. So all good luck with it. I've been speaking with Nicholas Forster, Assistant Professor of Cinema Studies at the University of Oregon. And thank you so much for the conversation.
Thanks so much. It was a pleasure.
Welcome to the research notes portion of UO Today. In this short segment, we invite UO humanities faculty to share recent publications and accomplishments and explain why humanistic research matters to you, to us, and to humanity. In this episode of Research Notes, Steve Rodgers tells us about his project, Art, Music, Performance, a mobile performance and exhibition space. Steve Rodgers is the Edmund A. Cykler Chair in Music and Professor of Music Theory and Musicianship at the School of Music and Dance at the University of Oregon. Steve, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here and chat with you.
Well, we're delighted to have you on the show. Tell us, how would you describe your research focus?
I have been at the U of O for 20 years, and my research has changed over time, as anyone's does. I am obsessed with song, words, and music. A lot of my publications have had to do with exploring the interaction of words and music, that kind of magical amalgam of sound and words in songs from throughout music history. I focus a lot on 19th century songs, and I've become more and more interested in songs by underrepresented composers, by women composers, composers of color. I wrote a book on Fanny Mendelssohn, who is the sister of Felix Mendelssohn, and recently a book on Clara Schumann, who is the wife of Robert Schumann. And I guess what gets me up in the morning is trying to find new voices that need to be heard and share them with a broader community. And in that sense, a lot of my work has shifted from just writing for other music theorists, and I still do plenty of that, to doing more public forms of scholarship. And the project that we'll talk about, although it's not so much a research project, it's more of like a community building project, but it strikes me that it stems from my desire to build bridges between the world that I inhabit, music theory, music analysis, and other worlds where people are interested in similar things.
That is really great. Can you tell us about that project since you brought it up? What is art, music, performance?
So it is, first I'll just describe what it is and then maybe tell you how it came about. It's not a book, it's not an article, it's not a podcast. It's a physical thing. It's basically a tiny home that will function as a mobile exhibition performance space. And it's the kind of thing that can be hooked up to a truck and moved anywhere around campus. And it's actually in the process of being built by a tiny home company in Eugene called True Form Tiny. And it will be fully outfitted with sound, AV, tech, lighting, etc. And the front will open up, and it's a small stage that can be used for musical performances, dance performances, poetry readings, art exhibitions, uh, you name it. Lots of things that I couldn't even imagine. And so that's what it is. It's something that those of us who've put it together have affectionately called the duck truck. It's not actually a truck, but it's a mobile performance exhibition space. We think of it as kind of like a tiny desk concert, but something that can pop up, in front of the art museum or near the EMU or in different parts of campus and the community. So that's what it is, and it's called Art Music Performance, which is the acronym is AMP, so it's sort of clever, AMP, because it's literally amplifying the performers, but also in a more metaphorical way, amplifying voices that don't always have a stage. We thought a lot about the inaccessibility of performance and exhibitions around campus that are costly, that are hard to get to. And we thought, well, how could we do something that would provide a literal and figurative platform, a stage for people who want to have their their art, their music shared with a wider community? And how could we bring people together doing that? It struck us that there's nothing like hearing, experiencing art in a public space to connect people. And that's where this project came from. And I should say, before I get too far, that it could not have happened had we not received an ideal campus climate matching grant that provided considerable resources to build the thing and outfit it. There's just no way we could have done it. So I'm really grateful to the Division of Equity and Inclusion for providing these grants that we applied for and were lucky to get. And finally, we is not just me, we is the Committee for Equity and Inclusion in the School of Music and Dance, which I chaired for 3 years. And this project came out of a collaboration, a discussion with that group. So it's not my project, even though I'm kind of the leader, the shepherd to build the thing and get it out there into the world.
That's great. When do you anticipate that it's going to start circulating around campus?
Well, I am happy to say that it's, as I mentioned, it's being built. Probably every week I get a series of photos from the head builder at True Form Tiny, this tiny home company. And we expect that probably by the end of this term or the beginning of spring term, it will be a finished, beautiful material thing. It's about, like 15 by 10 or 12. It's a small home, which functions as a stage. And our goal is to unveil it in the spring. And in fact, the Division of Equity and Inclusion is having a big celebratory event for everyone who got one of these grants. And people are doing amazing things like mentorship programs and um, programs to help advise students and to bring different people together. And that's happening April 29th, all day long. I don't know where it will be, but we just met with all of the other award winners. And our hope is that the duck truck, the amp space, can be outside, probably outside the EMU with music and performance and other things that will be a kind of hub to draw people to this event. So that's happening at the end of the year, and we're hoping to unveil it and make it available to anyone who wants to use it. So if you were a student or a faculty member or a community member and you have a project idea, you would submit a proposal, get it accepted, and this amp space will live in a secured location, and you would kind of rent it and then bring it to a location on campus where it can be used and do a pop-up concert or something like that. So the hope is that anyone can use it if they have an interesting project, and that I don't know, maybe even long after I've left the U of O, it'll still be popping up around campus somewhere. That's my hope.
Well, I hope that that's true. And I also hope that you don't leave UO for a very long time. So
Well, not
in,
likely.
in the meantime, I'm going to jot April 29th down on my
April
calendar.
29th, yeah.
So, Steve, what makes art music performance important to humanity?
Well, as someone who is in the humanities, I think we all know that the humanities are under fire, that sometimes STEM fields get more money, prestige, privilege, etc. They're seen as sort of kind of more valuable than the softer things that we do in the humanities. And this project, I think, I hope that it will show the visceral, powerful impact that the humanities, the arts have to bring communities together. I mean, that to me um, is why we do what we do. It makes our lives worth living. I mean, people come to the University of Oregon to teach in the STEM fields because we have a great symphony, because there's a School of Music and Dance, because there are poetry readings and people like you in the Humanities Center hosting lectures and other events. So that's what glues us together. And our hope is that this project can glue together the many different humans around campus, and not just the faculty members, also staff members and students and people who can be drawn together to experience art and music communally, and to do so in an outdoors space, which is a different form of community building. I mean, uh, so many groups of people have been drawn together by experiencing and making art, even forms of protest that are involved in the making of art and music in outdoor spaces. So this is an outdoor space that's meant to bring as many humans together as possible. So that's, I think, how it relates to humanity and the humanities.
And where can we learn more about art music performance?
Well, as I said before, keep your eyes on the UO website and other missives that will come out about the event on April 29th. That's when not just our project, but all of the Ideal Campus Climate Grant projects will be unveiled. And we hope in the School of Music and Dance to advertise this as much as possible as it's being built, as it's being unveiled, so that it's something that everyone knows they can access and use as they want to.
That sounds great, and we'll be sure to be publicizing it as well here through the OHC.
Well, thank you for doing that.
Thank you for joining us today, Steve. We really appreciated the conversation.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
I have been speaking with Professor Stephen Rodgers from the UO's School of Music and Dance. UO Today is a production of the Oregon Humanities Center at the University of Oregon. Thanks for listening.